On September 1st, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. Several Polish towns along the border were bombed, including the town of Wayfinder, where over 1,000 civilians were killed. Later that day, American President Franklin Roosevelt stated, quote, "The ruthless bombing from the air of civilians and unfortified centers of population during the course of hostilities which have raged in various quarters of the earth during the past few years, which has resulted in the maiming and in the death of thousands of defenseless men, women, and children, has sickened the hearts of every civilized man and woman, and has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity." End quote. 4 years later, American heavy bombers were ruthlessly bombing civilians and unfortified centers of population. Precision bombing had failed to cripple German industry, so American generals decided to kill German workers. The target for October 10, 1943, were civilians in Munster, a historic city with a population of 155,000. According to the plan, 247 B-17 bombers would arrive over Münster at high noon on Sunday. Their aiming point was Münster's 1,000-year-old cathedral, when the church was packed with civilians. Official accounts mention this. See one linked in the description. Some bomber crewmen were upset because American bombers had always targeted military or industrial sites in past missions. Over 700 German civilians were killed in the Münster raid, dressed in their Sunday best, so ready for burial. It seems that God disapproved of this satanic attack because it was a disaster. Many more German fighters appeared than expected, while American escort fighters showed up late. The American 13th Combat Wing lost 30 B-17s that day. German fighters had learned it was most effective to concentrate on specific groups of bombers. They focused on the 100th Bomb Group that day, which lost 12 of its 13 B-17s. The crew of the surviving bomber is pictured here and returned with damage and injured crewmen. The American bomber campaign had begun in 1943 and failed. As explained in the tale linked in the description, American bombers were slaughtered in 1943. American aircraft and manpower losses were greater than the damage they inflicted on German industry. Leaders in Washington, D.C. demanded change. Destroying Germany's rail system would cripple its war effort, so bombers targeted German rail yards. This strategy failed because railroad tracks are very narrow, made of heavy steel, and low to the ground, so only a direct hit caused damage. This required great luck from a high-altitude bomber. Moreover, rail lines were easy to repair. American generals decided that bombing civilian rail workers was a better tactic, and the best time was Sunday at noon, when hundreds gathered at church. Allied bombers destroyed all known German industrial targets by mid-1944, as the Germans moved production to small, hidden, dispersed locations. Allied intelligence was unable to locate most of these, but they knew where the German workers lived, so bombed housing areas. Every city and town had a central train station, so that was the excuse used to target population centers, even though few bombs actually hit railroad tracks. By 1945, German cities had been destroyed, except for some in southern Germany that had no military or energy production facilities. They had doubled in population, with refugees escaping the Russian advance and refugees from bombed-out cities in the north. With no other big targets, Allied leaders decided to bomb them. The Germans had lost the war by 1945, with American troops entering Germany from the west and the advancing Russians close to Berlin. Allied leaders wanted the aerial destruction to continue, so chose the beautiful city of Dresden that was far from the fighting and had never been bombed. Over 25,000 German civilians were killed, according to official figures, although some historians estimate 10 times more were killed because it was overcrowded with 500,000 German refugees and no bomb shelters for them. This slaughter was controversial and justified by saying some German soldiers were in the city, just like every city in Germany. It was said the Soviets needed help in their battle toward Berlin, but Dresden was far south of Berlin, and there were no stockpiles of German equipment, supplies, or large German units that could have used Dresden's rail lines to deploy to Berlin. Here is an account of this bombing from a British POW.
In the greatest blitz on Germany, British bombers head for Dresden.
I've seen brutality on its highest levels, but nothing prepared me for what I saw at Dresden. Nothing.
Victor Gregg joined the army in 1937. He was a prisoner of war in the city when the bombers came.
Now they hit Dresden hardest of all.
Dresden had no defences, neither did its people. 25,000 died in a single night.
Women and children, old people, refugees, all being blasted to death with no means of fighting back, nothing to defend themselves with, and still the incessant bombs coming down.
Allied forces pounded the city with almost 4,000 tons of explosives and bombs, creating a firestorm that tore through its streets, stripping it to its skeleton.
Several smaller German cities were destroyed by senseless mass bomber attacks in 1945, to include Swinemünden, a beautiful seaside resort packed with refugees, where 23,000 civilians were slaughtered. Bombers even targeted German farm towns, as explained in the tale American Aerial Massacres in Germany, linked in the description. When American bombers began bombing Germany in 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force learned the best way to destroy Germany's rail system. As bombers returned home from Germany, their fighter escorts were free to dive down to attack ground targets. Bombers were unable to hit locomotives from high altitude, but fighters could strafe them at very low levels. This proved highly successful, but it wasn't until air support focus was shifted to prepare for the June 1944 invasion at Normandy that fighters were allowed to fly their own attack missions. They began to destroy Germany's rail system and killed few civilians in the process. American generals knew that mass bomber missions to destroy rail yards were ineffective and mostly killed civilians, but continued to lie to the press by claiming bomber targets were railroad marshalling yards. There are two reasons behind this genocidal behavior. The first was bureaucratic competition fueled by American General Hap Arnold. He was chief of the Army Air Forces throughout World War II and the force behind the U.S. Army Air Corps that grew from 20,000 in 1935 to over 2 million soldiers in 1944. This was accomplished with a massive public relations effort that promoted air power propaganda. Huge bombing raids made great news stories. This was shown in the great post-war bomber movie called Command Decision, when an Army Air Corps general dismisses concern about aircraft losses. He describes the political struggle to expand the Army Air Corps and states the Germans aren't the only enemy. Air Corps generals fought the U.S. Army and Navy for funding and manpower and needed big bombing raids to win arguments. Another factor is the psychopathic culture that developed among Air Corps generals as they showed little concern for the random death and destruction caused by mass aerial bombing. General Curtis LeMay shocked people with a total lack of empathy for innocents and enthusiasm for atomic bombs. In the classic movie Dr. Strangelove, his character was excited to start a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Another movie, The War Lover, starred a psychopathic American bomber pilot played by Steve McQueen. His love for war and destruction remains common among American generals to this day.
Some men love war, the way others love women. This is the story of both kinds. There's only two things that mean anything to me, flying and women.
In that order?
In any order, or both together.
So you're enjoying the war?
I like my work.
Work?
Lady, I belong to the most destructive group of men the world has ever known. That's my work.